Well, kia ora ngā whānau o tu motu nei. Hello to the family throughout the land of New Zealand, and hello to the family over the ditch in Australia. My name's Dave Mann. I hail originally from a town in New Zealand called Hawara in South Taranaki. And to give you a bit of my story before we get into this, I come from a home that had an amount of brokenness within it. My mother came to faith when I was an early teenager, and the change it made to her life, I couldn't deny it. So I simply thought, well, I need to have whatever she's got. And as I reached out to this God I couldn't see, I had an experience of the love of God. And I knew that I knew that I was loved. And I've never been able to not deny that. I know what I was like before I knew Christ. I know what I'm like after I know Christ. And I guess one of the greatest things I've wanted to do in my life since then is help other people discover something of that reality that I discovered. So I went to a Bible college for 3 years straight out of school. I then was in outreach ministry, working in the community in New Zealand for about 8 years. I was a pastor at a church in Singapore for about 9 years. And then 11 years ago, we returned to New Zealand with my wife. We've got 4 boys. To the beautiful city of Tauranga, the sun coming in through the window here today. And we're involved in national outreach ministry on a strategic base, identifying gaps in the outreaching efforts of the church as a whole to try and bring innovation to them. Anyway, great to be a part of Go Train. My sincere apologies is that you're actually watching a video right now. I'm unable to join the live event because I have a clash. But my friend Stu has said bring something anyway, because often what I bring is just a little bit different to what others might bring. The house I grew up in, Dad was quite an authoritarian, and at the dinner table, whatever Dad said was right. There was no conversation. We weren't taught conversational skills. Even if Dad was wrong, you couldn't disagree with him because then you'd be defying his authority as the head of the house. So for me, Christian witness has been pretty difficult. Some people are just all excited. They get out there, they tell the message of Jesus. They've got all their amazing stories. For me, conversations with people have been difficult because I've felt intimidated in conversations, and I've had to really think this through across the years to find my confidence, and you could say my lane, within which I could be a better witness for Jesus. So what I'm going to bring you today is a bit different, maybe, to what's in the other videos. We'll talk briefly about the gospel, but I think the key hindrance for a lot of people in being a witness is actually conversational skills. You see, how do you have a non-threatening two-way conversation with someone you fundamentally disagree with? That's what we're going to look at. I'm going to play during this 2 5-minute videos we've made. We've got a series of 16 and we'll show you the web link so you can get hold of those to use those in your church or youth group or small group if you want to. Let's get into it. 5 points. Point number 1, we need to have a clear understanding of what we believe and of what our message is. Hopefully other videos in this online platform today are going to explain that. But I do think it's a responsibility when we have a question about our faith to research it and find an answer, not just for ourselves, but because we might help someone else. When it comes to the core Christian message, often called the gospel, I remember this by thinking of 4 words: creation, fall, Jesus, and restoration. If they're each explained in one simple sentence, you can actually share that core message in about 30 seconds. For example, as Christians, we believe there's a God who's over everything. He made it all perfect. He made people. He gave us free will so there could be love. The problem is that we misused the free will. We began to do things that were selfish, and this wrecked relationships, and in truth, we're wrecking our planet. And that's where Jesus comes in, because God didn't make the bad stuff, and he wants to fix it. Jesus died and rose. That was to take a punishment for the wrongs that we've done, so that we could be restored to a relationship with him and with each other and with our planet and also with God beyond in eternity. And that's the Christian message in a nutshell. But you see, the question is very quickly, what am I going to say next when I've said that? I would probably typically share my testimony, a short story, for 30 seconds to maybe 45 seconds. But we're going to have to turn it back to a conversation. Point number 2, 5 points, and we'll give you a video with this one. The key to great conversations is great questions. And it took me a lot of years to work out that I'd be far more effective in outreach if I would focus less on what I wanted to explain or communicate and would instead focus more on actually connecting with a person first to understand where they are at. To make this point, we're going to play a video, and very ironically, it's about removing the agenda of sharing the gospel.
Many Christians struggle to discuss their faith with others. So today, we're going to give you our number one tip to help initiate spiritual conversations.
And because it sounds a bit crazy, we're going to jump straight on in.
Because our number one tip to help people find freedom in sharing the gospel is to remove the agenda of sharing the gospel for a while.
Now, you might ask, how does that make sense?
Well, let's consider the logic.
The reason spiritual conversations are difficult for some of us is because we're aware that we're trying to sell them something to someone who might not want to hear it. It's like we're trying to share our version of the truth with someone who thinks differently. So, how about this as a thought? What if our nerves are legitimate because we're picking up on something that's real?
You see, what might happen if we approach this differently? Instead of the starting goal being to tell them the gospel, we instead put that agenda aside for a while and ask some sincere questions as the starting point. You see, for me, I'm genuinely interested in spiritual things. And so when I started doing this, I still took an interest in people's spiritual beliefs using questions. But because the questions came with no agenda to have to tell them something, I wasn't nervous, so they weren't nervous, and it changed the dynamic of the conversation.
You see, if we ask open-ended questions, people open up. And if we're not pushing anything too much, they have no reason to be defensive. And because questions beg questions, it's surprising where a conversation like that can go.
For example, a hitchhiker replied to a question I once asked by saying, "I'm not really interested in religion." But because my goal wasn't to preach at them, I wasn't disappointed. So I asked what came naturally, which was, "Well, what are you interested in?" To which they ironically felt safe enough to talk about religion, and we had a great conversation. In another similar conversation, when a guy said, "I'm not interested in religion," I once simply quipped back and said, "Why is that?" Because I was genuinely interested, and because he could tell I didn't have an agenda, we had a great conversation.
Which is to say, the freedom of the conversation has a lot to do with the dynamics of the conversation. If we want conversations to be open and real, we can't start with an agenda like a salesperson. Instead, we need to ask authentic questions and let the conversation take its natural path. Give us an example of this, Dave.
I was on a plane one day, and the guy sitting next to me and I introduced ourselves. And he discovered I was in Christian ministry and simply said, "I don't really want to talk about religion," which was fine with me, so we talked about other things. After a few minutes, he said, "Hey, what do Christians think about this?" To which I replied with a single sentence and turned the conversation back to what we were already talking about because he'd broken a rule of conversation. He changed the topic midway. So what do you think he did?
He ignored your question?
Exactly right. He asked a succession of sincere questions about the Christian faith for the remaining hour of the flight.
Now, let's look at what just happened. First, when Dave found a way to mention spiritual things early on, it made spiritual things a possible topic of the conversation.
But then when the man said he didn't want to talk about religion, I don't think he was saying he wasn't interested in religion.
Yeah, maybe he was actually just asking or saying he didn't want to be preached at.
And that was fine with me because I had no agenda to preach at him and I was happy to respect the boundary.
But then he asked Dave a spiritual question. Why?
I don't think it was actually about the question he asked. I think the unspoken question was more like,
"You seem reasonably normal to me. Can you talk about spiritual things without having to say everything at once and without always having to be right?"
To which my one sentence reply was intuition kicking in. It was a way of saying, "You can lead the conversation. I won't push anything." To which his unspoken reply was,
"Well, thanks, because actually I've got a lot of questions."
And I quickly had the impression he'd been waiting years to ask them.
You see, if we look at Jesus' conversations in the Bible, the approach he modeled was this. He asked questions with an ear open to the Spirit. There was no one formula or script.
And every conversation was different because every person was different.
Exactly. And that's really all we're saying. If you find spiritual conversations difficult, why not try putting your agendas aside for a while?
That's right. Try to understand what they believe. Ask sincere questions because questions beg questions. And with this approach, I've found that opportunities do open up.
Hey, we hope this helps.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. I have actually felt nervous communicating that point sometimes because, of course, we're supposed to get out there to communicate our message. But the point is that if we're just out there like a salesperson to push our pitch on someone and get someone saved, well, actually, we have no right to dictate that they have to listen to our message, do we? And the truth is that none of us can get anyone saved. Only God can do that convicting a heart, and only the person can do that by choosing to respond to the message. Like Raki said inside that video, the freedom of the conversation has a lot to do with the dynamics of the conversation. I hope that was helpful. Point number 3, we're going to have to work out how to deal with disagreement. At the start of this, I said that rather than giving a training on just how to share the gospel, I wanted to give a training on how to engage conversations, and in particular with people we might fundamentally disagree with. This is a growing portion of our society. In fact, in our society, there's even hostility at times toward us as Christians, as a prejudice is built through public media and education and by other means, against some of our core beliefs and values. Rather than play a video on this, we do actually have a video on the topic. I want to summarise the points it made to keep this really brief. How do you deal with disagreement? Someone's with you, they say something you fundamentally disagree with. Well, the first key is not to disagree. In conversations these days, everyone's got their own truth. You disagree and they might think, well, good for you, glad you found your truth, I've got my truth. And the conversation could be over. Or if you disagree, there could be tension and they go, man, that's awkward, and they pull back. The key points I would put to you is when someone disagrees, applaud something that's good and then ask a question about what you don't understand. For a simple example that's in the video we have on this topic, I was in the car with a young lady, I knew her well, one day, and she wasn't and isn't a Christian believer still. And she said to me, Dave, I've been thinking about spiritual things. Now, I thought that was pretty bold of her because she knew I was really into my Christian faith. I was sort of wondering if she was scared I might preach at her. And so I just said, well, what are you thinking to do about that? And she says, well, I've been thinking about getting into Ouija boards. Now, if you don't know what these are, it's sort of a thing that Christians would consider to be part of the occult, probably drawing more upon demonic powers than God's powers. What am I supposed to say? Should I say, oh, what would you do that for? Knowing her as I do, she possibly would have said to me, oh, who the F do you think you are? You know, mental note, never talk to him again about religion. What I instead said was, brilliant. I love the fact that you see yourself as a spiritual person. We're on the same page, me too. Why Ouija boards? And I tried to carry no tone of condescension or judgment in the way I asked that question. She explained why, but that gave me opportunity to explain why it just didn't make sense to me. I couldn't understand why she'd look at what seemed to me like a little game of Monopoly on the corner of a table, when the Christian faith is like a big smorgasbord that answers all the big questions of life. And she then explained why she was never going to look at Christianity. And my point is simply this. Had I disagreed with her up front, that conversation would have ended. Her initial statements, even her comment about Ouija boards, weren't the real topic. The real topic was why she wasn't looking at Christianity. And we had an opportunity to discuss that because I was able to keep the conversation open by using questions. Let's move on to point number 4. And this is about the power of stories, and I'm going to play you a video shortly, which is simply titled, When It's Right to Confuse People. You see, I needed a role model for conversations, and as I've mentioned already, in our home you weren't even allowed to have a conversation because you weren't allowed to disagree with the man of the house in any way, shape or form. And so I searched history and I've searched the world and I found a role model, and you might have heard of him. His name is Jesus. And in case you haven't picked it up already, all the examples and the points that are being made actually connect to the scriptures, and we actually provide sermon resources doing that, that pastors can use with matching small group discussion guides as well. Jesus talked with people and did things like intriguing them with silly illustrations. You need to be born again, Nicodemus. What do you mean? He meets a Samaritan woman who's going to be suspicious of them because there's a gender and a racial divide. She's probably got an inferiority complex. He engages her in casual conversation with humour, talking about a well of water he could give her so she'd never have to draw water from a well again to be able to go and do cooking in her house. Incredible people skills. But then he has people come to him asking him questions that are designed as a trap, like, should we give taxes to Caesar? He replies the question with a question. Why are you trying to trap me? Calling their bluff. He has another occasion when people come to him to engage in open conversation. Look, Jesus, we found this woman caught in adultery. Tell us what we should do. And again, it was a trap. If Jesus had answered, he could have buried himself. So he wisely squatted down on the ground, drew in the sand for a while, probably saying, okay, God, give me wisdom. What should I do? Because if I speak, I can bury myself. And then God gave him the wisdom that he needed. You see, Jesus engaged with the interested. But when a person was disinterested, Jesus only tried to intrigue them. And when a person was hostile, the truth is Jesus actually deflected them. So let's have a quick look at Jesus' parables, because a lot of us won't have noticed that in the storytelling Jesus did, it says that he never explained the parables to the crowds.
They're in the kitchen.
Where?
In the pantry.
Where?
On the left,
Where?
eye level,
Where?
blue container. Have you ever tried to explain something to someone and they just couldn't get it? As believers, we rightly feel we have a responsibility to communicate messages clearly, but life isn't always a straight line. So what I want to suggest today is that clear communication is not always the best option. There's actually a time to leave people confused, and because this might sound like a bit of a strange message, we're going to look at a figure in history who did this, and his name was Jesus. You see, contrary to what many think, Jesus did not always make matters clear, and I'm referring here in particular to his parables. Jesus' parables were at one level tools for communication. They were illustrations, they were memorable, they made points clear. But did you ever notice that Jesus never explained the parables to the crowds? In Matthew 13, following the parable of the sower, the disciples couldn't understand what Jesus was saying. So they asked, "Why do you speak in parables to the people?" He explained, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them." You see, while Jesus did go on to explain the parables to the disciples, he didn't for the crowds. In Matthew 13, it says he didn't say anything to the crowds without using a parable. In John 16, the disciples talk about how Jesus' public speaking was actually unclear. It was shrouded in figures of speech. Yet when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything. So why did he mask the truth to the public? I suggest it's because there were a range of people in the audience. Some who were interested, some disinterested, and others hostile. So for those who were interested, the parables could be reflected upon and could be understood. Mark 4 confirms this. Jesus expected that his followers would work out the meaning of the parables. But for those who were disinterested, it was different. The parables were a tool of intrigue to get people thinking, while for the hostile, well, it didn't give them the quotable quote or the media scoop they wanted, did it? So in short, what did the parables achieve? They were a mechanism for sifting audiences, speaking differently to those who were interested, disinterested, and hostile. Now, to apply this to us, firstly, Jesus spoke to the crowds, and so must we. None of this is an excuse for silence. But secondly, we must do this wisely, because there are sometimes a range of different people in our audiences. Now, Jesus spoke in parables. What could we say? We could, of course, give illustrations from the world around us like Jesus did. But I have another specific suggestion. How about we tell stories of God at work in our bicultural history, God at work in our values history, and God at work in people's lives today? Regarding our bicultural history here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Christian faith was foundational to the Treaty of Waitangi. The missionaries and their friends in England and all their anti-colonialistic ambitions are the reason the treaty came about that we have. The public don't know these stories, yet they validate why Christianity really is a core part of who we are as a nation. Regarding our values history, most of our nation's most treasured values have come through the Christian tradition. It was people of faith who helped establish radical Christian ideas in our thinking as a nation, like equality, selflessness, and integrity. These enabled us to become the caring, charitable, accepting, and prosperous nation that we are today. And regarding God at work in people's lives today, well, this is simply called testimony. And the fact is, stories of people finding hope are exactly the kinds of stories the public love to hear. To make the point, if we were to research and tell these kinds of stories more, they'd work just like the parables, bringing revelation to those who are ready for it, while intriguing those whose hearts were not, while giving those with hostile intent no grounds to attack us, because all we've done is tell a story from history. So in summary, there's a time to make a matter clear, but there's also a time to conceal a matter. As Jesus said, you don't throw your pearls to the swine. So let's learn from Jesus, because he not only thrived despite the hostility, he succeeded in changing the world.
I hope you enjoyed that video. I've become increasingly convinced over the years, trying to be a witness for Jesus and to this amazing message that we carry, that stories are actually more important than I ever realised when I was younger. The older I get, the more important the stories are. In New Zealand, as is mentioned in that video, we have an incredible heritage. Christianity is intrinsic to that. Our values, our freedoms of speech and religion, our equality of races, equality of genders, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, so many things within our history, our education system, the healthcare system, the values of charity we have, come directly from a history which Christianity is intrinsic to. And in case we haven't noticed the point, the stories of history about what God has done are actually just testimony. It's the testimony of God at work in history, shaping our culture. And by telling those stories, you're actually telling people something about who we are as a nation. And they can't argue with you because it's just history. And it builds a bridge and it changes perspectives. You see, if people are really negative toward us, and if they've been inside a subculture in our communities which thinks that religion and Christianity is the problem with the world, not the solution, how do we get through that? We're going to need to be wise, and I suggest that storytelling is a key part. Let's come to our final point, then I'll share a couple of stories and we'll be done possibly early. Point number 5, we need to invite a response. And within our conversations, I suggest this is easy. There's many ways to do it. It doesn't have to be to make a decision to follow Jesus. We can invite a person to engage us in another conversation or to look at a video. We can invite a person to come and join us at a church program or something like that. Or we could ask a person if they feel ready to pray. And if that's the case, leading a person in a prayer is as simple as ABC. A, we admit and we've done wrong and ask for forgiveness, 2 words with A. B, because we believe in what Jesus has done at the cross. And C, we commit to follow God with our lives. So they ask, well, what does it mean to be a Christian? Well, we're simply people who admit we've done wrong and ask to be forgiven because we believe in what Jesus has done. And we commit our lives to follow him and follow his teachings. Very simple framework, and you can use that as a framework for a simple prayer. I'd like to give you a couple of stories to finish up. I've given stories already in the context of the videos and other things of conversations, so I want to share a couple of stories from different contexts. A part of our work is a project we do, a media project in New Zealand called the Hope Project. And this is, we're looking actually at 3 media projects per year, but the main one of these is at Easter. And we're trying to keep something of the Christian faith in the public view at Christmas and Easter. And it's resulted in booklets like this being distributed to most homes in New Zealand prior to Easter 8 times now. We're in the middle of one of these projects right now, and for a couple of stories from emails I've had this week. A lady emailed to say, look, thank you so much for your booklet. She said, I'm waiting to have an operation and I'm feeling pretty nervous. So I have been praying and your booklet has then arrived. And I just want you to know that the prayer that's included at the back of this booklet really meant a lot to me. Thanks for that. Could I please have a copy of the New Testament to read more about Jesus? And my point is very simply that we can engage conversations through conversations, but we can also engage conversations through materials and books and booklets. Another story we had this week was of a lady who relayed the story. I don't know if she was a Christian herself, but she was a caregiver to her elderly father. The booklet arrived to fill the day. They opened the booklet, they trusted it because it's got New Zealand history stories and they know the booklets from previous years. She read it to him, and at the conclusion, he said, I want to pray that prayer. And so instead of just reading the prayer, he prayed the prayer to commit to know and follow Jesus. And to give you one final story from an online conversation. Online, we actually have a few 100,000 people engage with us each year. Most people who are antagonistic toward the Christian faith don't want to change their views online. Conversation online just doesn't usually work that way. But I had an amazing conversation with a guy this past year where he came on in an antagonistic way. And he was asking about suffering and how God must be responsible for it. So I simply replied, this is on Facebook, so it's short replies, to say, you sound a lot like this guy in the Bible called Job. He was super angry at God for things, and they engaged a conversation about it. He writes back and says, well, I'd like to read that. So we ended up sending him a Bible to read the book of Job. He then came back with a myriad of questions about God and faith. And I answered some of them, but I then actually cut the conversation short and said, look, you could come back with 1,000,000 questions and we could go forever. At the end of the day, there's a dynamic here, which is faith. We have to look at what we think might be real and true and actually take a step of faith and say, well, God, if you're there, could you reveal yourself to me? Well, he went quiet for a while, and then he came back and he said, you know what? It's amazing how different I feel since I decided to just trust God, even though a lot of this stuff still makes no sense to me. And the last Facebook message that I had from him, he said, I just wanted you to know I'm looking to get along now to a church near me and to check it out. So I hope this has helped. The key to great conversations is great questions. There is no one formula or method for sharing our message. We have no right to push it on other people. But we can ask questions, we can engage conversations, we can share what we think, we can tell stories and testimonies that can act as evidence for the message that we have communicated. And this isn't just about reaching people we don't know by going out on some mission. This is about finding ways to reach the people we do know, the people in our houses and our neighbours, our workplaces and our schools, the people we engage with every day. Jesus modelled amazing conversational skills. Let's learn from him. Hope this has been helpful.